Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Amalia, and I'm a webinar manager at Terminal. Terminal is the world's first tech-enabled platform for remote engineering teams. Today, we're presenting Hybrid Tech Teams in Action, How to Tackle the Era of Flexible Work, with Dan Pupius, the founder and CEO of Range, and Dylan Sirota, co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer at Terminal. This webinar is part of the Going Remote by Terminal webinar series. Going Remote by Terminal is a monthly series that delivers the insights engineering and HR leaders need to build effective remote teams. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. Today's webinar is scheduled to last about 1 hour. All participants will be muted to enable the speakers to present without interruption. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your Zoom control panel. We'll have time to answer these at the end. We want to make this an interactive experience, so there'll be moments during the webinar where we'll ask poll questions. We'll announce polls as we launch them. A pop-up will appear on your screen and you'll be able to submit an answer at that time. With that said, I'd like to give participants a moment to take advantage of an early registration opportunity for our next event, as well as the entirety of our Going Remote series before we get started. Countrywide engineering talent shortages and exorbitant salaries are making the US a difficult environment for building tech teams with local talent. In today's increasingly remote and hybrid work environment, the subject of today's discussion, companies have an opportunity to go global. And with the recent Latin American tech boom, it's now no secret that much of the world's best engineering team is in Latin America, and high-growth companies should be hiring there as well. In our next webinar, you'll find out more about Latin America's talent market, including the top 7 Latin American cities for scaling remote engineering teams and how to approach talent in each market. I'll leave the poll up a couple minutes as we finish out our intro. So back to housekeeping. After today's webinar ends, we've prepared a short feedback survey that will show up in your browser window, which we use to improve webinar content in the future. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent via email within 24 hours of the event. So, on to our agenda. Today's event will start out with a quick introduction to Terminal and Range. Next, we'll talk about the emerging era of hybrid work, bring you some insights on the future of distributed teams, and what 1,000 plus engineers said they want work to look like in Terminal's recent State of Remote Work survey. We'll then move into our main fireside chat segment with the wonderful Dan Pupius. Lastly, we'll have time for questions at the end. Now, without further ado, we'll turn the time over to our speakers. A little bit about our presenters today. Dan is the founder and CEO of Range. Prior to founding Range, he was head of engineering at Medium, and before that, a staff software engineer at Google. He has an MA in industrial design and a bachelor's of science in artificial intelligence. He now lives in California with his wife and 2 daughters. Dylan is Terminal's co-founder and chief strategy officer. He formulated the idea for Terminal at Eventbrite, where he spent 7 years building teams that spanned sales, strategy, and product, including an engineering team of over 100 in Mendoza, Argentina. So, Dylan, I will let you take it from here and dive into our material for today.
Great. Thank you, Amalia. Dan, great to be with you and really excited to have our chat in a little bit. But first, I want to give a quick background on both Terminal and Range for context for the audience. So first, a little background on Terminal to set the context for this conversation. You know, what we saw was that the biggest problem facing growing technology businesses was access to talent. And the complexity of hiring and scaling global teams was something that wasn't solved. And so at Terminal, what we set out to do is build a simple, scalable solution that allows growing tech companies to access the talent they need to scale. And the way we focused on that is first, analyzing global talent pools so we can help our clients identify the right market for the right technology stack, seniority, and types of engineers they need to hire. We then have a combination of team process technology that allows us to quickly route our clients' needs into the right market, identify and qualify candidates for them to quickly interview and get to a hire. Once our clients hire an individual, we actually employ them through Terminal. So we become the employer of record to ensure that they have a world-class full-time employment experience, no different than you would have for someone locally for your team. Outside of that, we also have a technical community. So for all of our members that we've hired, we give them access to programming to encourage learning around new technologies, frameworks, to interact and connect and network with other like-minded engineers, as well as mentor programs so that there's a constant learning environment so your teams are engaged and retained. And we've worked with some great high growth companies like Chime, Gusto, Nextdoor, Hims and Hers, and we've hired over 600 engineers now to date for some of these companies. So to transition now, Dan, would love to share a little bit more about your company Range with the audience here. And again, so thrilled to be with you. I think that the work that you guys are doing really sets you up as such an interesting perspective on the era of remote work and hybrid work. So Range is an asynchronous communication tool. It really allows top remote teams to be able to stay connected without redundant meetings. And this is what I love. And I think we've probably all seen this through this era of remote work, that it's very easy to layer Zoom meeting upon Zoom meeting. But Range is really trying to make that a much more pleasant experience for allowing teams to stay connected. As you can see, they're funded by some of the best investors in the Valley. They work and are trusted by some of the best engineering teams, and they're a remote first company, and they come with a lot of experience, perspective, and data and research to inform a lot of their opinions. So what does Range look like? It first starts with check-ins. And this is a very lightweight way that teams can know what's happening, again, without spending that time on Zoom. It connects teams, allows you to build this trust, psychological safety, so that as an engineer or as a manager, you don't have to kind of default into that mode of micromanagement. And I love the term, the scaffolding for great teamwork. I think of this as software combined with process that drives productive outcomes for great teams. So Dan, thank you so much again for joining us here today. And before we dive into the conversation, I wanted to go through a little bit of research that we've done to really tee up the conversation based on what we're seeing today. And I think we'll all go back and look and claim that 2020 was the year that took us remote. No doubt, it was kind of this forced, interesting experiment that was forced upon so many different teams and companies. But now, as we enter 2021, as we see some light at the end of the tunnel with the close of the pandemic, a lot of questions around what does the return look like, and is there a return? And this is what we look at as this workforce paradigm shift. Looking to the next slide, the workforce of 2021, what's clear to us is that the return to normal isn't going to come. And we surveyed over 1,100 engineers across North and South America, across different age ranges, to try to get some insight into what the perspective is from talent on what do their preferences want and how have those shifted over the last year. Before we get to that, we're going to launch a quick poll for everyone. So we'll get a little audience participation going here. What we want to know is, what is workplace configuration in your company? What does that look like for the planning post-pandemic? And we'll give everyone about 30 seconds here to respond. And just as a reminder, Dan and I would love some hard questions at the end. So please feel free to put that into the Q&A for us later. All right. So almost 70% plan a mix of in-person and remote work. So good. I think you're in the right webinar here today. Many that also plan to have everyone work remotely, and looks like zero plan to have everyone return to the office. So this is probably a shift no one could have expected a year and a half ago, but tees us up nicely for some of the data and insights that we'll share here on the next slide. So as we surveyed these 1,100 engineers across the market, I think no surprise maybe to this group that 70% want some combination of remote and in-person. And this combination, I think, is where a lot of head spin of what is that right combination look like? What are the different flexible arrangements that make that work? Going to the next slide, I think that the takeaway is that the way we work is going to forever change. It forces a lot of decisions on leaders of how their companies are going to adapt and set up their employees. Now, the good news in the next slide is that 74% have actually said that their companies have adapted well to remote work. And I think about this statistic, if the pandemic was 10, 15 years ago, before the proliferation of communication tools, cloud computing, I mean, it would have been a completely different world. But luckily, with those tools, companies have been able to really adapt well. And so I think it's no surprise on the next slide that we see that 98% of engineers want to work remotely at least one day a week. So let's round that up to 100. Basically, every engineer wants some level of flexibility around in-office versus remote work. Going to the next slide, we also see that 1 in 3 want to stay remote 100% of the time. And so I think we now see the bookends on almost every engineer wants some level of flexibility of at least one day working remotely, and a third want to stay remote 100% of the time. So the spectrum in between is quite vast around what is the degree of flexibility and how companies set up their teams, policies, and infrastructure to support those models. This is all in the backdrop too, in the next slide, that supply and demand of technical talent is tipped so far in favor of talent that companies really need to be tuned in to what are the needs and what are the preferences of employees in order to have a talent strategy that can adequately compete in this environment. So for every engineer, every full stack engineer in the US, there are 3 available positions. So there's constantly opportunity out there for engineers to find alternative employment. And I think that's the real key, is that the competitive nature of this environment should really force leaders to think strategically and hard around what they are offering, not just from their company, their product, their perks and benefits, but from a work environment, from a working structure that is going to relate and attract and ultimately retain engineers, knowing that there are so many different opportunities on the table. And that really tees us up for the conversation that Dan and I are going to start here, which is how can leaders stay ahead in this hybrid future? Before we kick that off, we've got one more poll. Molly, if you'd be so kind, thank you. What are your biggest concerns about moving to a hybrid model? And based on the prior poll, looks like most of you are moving towards this model. So I'd love to get some insight and feedback from the audience here before we move on. All right. Inequities between remote and co-located workers. I think that's a great topic, so we'll make sure to cover that. Dan, 25% less alignment among team members, 20% loneliness and isolation. So somewhat of a distribution. Surprisingly, very few decreased productivity. That is really encouraging, that based on the experiment that's been run, that productivity, which I would say kind of prior to the pandemic was one of the biggest concerns for companies going remote, actually overcoming that mental hurdle through tools, process, or just having to live through that experience. So this is very helpful. Thank you everyone for participating. So Dan, to kick things off, I think, we see that hybrid work enables a range of different working models. And I think that you and your team have done a great job at trying to kind of make sense and put a framework around the prevalent models that we see emerging. And so maybe to kick this off, you can run through what those models are and how leaders can maybe evaluate which one might be best for their teams.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thanks for having me today. And there's some really interesting insights in the survey, and not totally surprising. So it's kind of cool. But yeah, I think the big mistake is thinking of hybrid as a single solution. And really, it's a spectrum. So it's a spectrum from like fully distributed, where everyone is in a unique location, to fully co-located, when everyone is in the office at the same time. And the spectrum is really across two axes. So it's flexibility on a where you're working and a when you're working. So across the spectrum, we've thought about a few different options. So one level up from the fully distributed team is a default digital team. And a default digital team is essentially you act as if everyone is fully distributed, but you may have some co-working spaces or offices. But your employees are very nomadic and will be on any given day, maybe in a coffee shop, maybe at home, maybe in an office. Static hybrid is a model where individuals always work in the same place. So I always work in San Francisco, and you can be guaranteed that in my core working hours, I will be in San Francisco, but you are always at home in, say, Colorado. So there's some predictability, but you are remote. Dynamic hybrid is an option for some teams who want to allow people to work at home certain days of the week. So let's say that you have a critical mass in Palo Alto and people are within commute distance in Palo Alto, but you want to allow some people to work at home 1 or 2 days a week. So you have this dynamic structure where people can be remote, say Monday, Tuesday, but Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, they're in the office. And then synchronized hybrid, sorry, dynamic hybrid is the other option where there's some flexibility about going into the office, but you're all kind of like co-located. And synchronized is where you work on a schedule, so that yeah, Monday, Friday is remote, like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in the office. So it creates more predictability and it's closer to an existing model of work, but gives people the ability to not have to commute.
Do you see many companies kind of falling into one bucket and then kind of moving more to the left of these models or to the right based on what works? How fluid are these as
Mhm.
far as the way in which companies are approaching some
Yeah.
of the differences?
I think some companies who are more conservative about allowing remote work will choose to use a synchronized model because it allows you to use some of the same practices that you use when you're all co-located. So it creates predictability. Managers have more visibility. You can have in-person one-on-ones. And then I think that you'd start layering in more flexibility over time. So my sense is for some companies, you're gonna gradually move to the left of this spectrum. And I think the optimal ideal is a default digital, where on any given day, time, you don't really care where people are. You can collaborate and communicate effectively, regardless of location.
Awesome. This is super helpful. So, transitioning a little bit to your past experience and your team today at Range, can you give us maybe a little background on the different workplace structures that
Mhm,
you've seen and how you set up the Range team today? And maybe has that evolved, or do you
mhm.
foresee it evolving based on the context of some of these working models?
Yeah, so I worked at Google for a long time, and we were distributed, but we didn't call it distributed. So on the Gmail team, we had people in San Francisco, Seattle, Zurich, and Tokyo, and we were collaborating across those locations. Um, then at Medium, we were hybrid. We had an office in San Francisco, but then we had a few remote people. Again, we didn't call it hybrid, and there were a bunch of issues around that setup that we had to figure out. Um, and then today at Range, we're fully distributed. We always expected to be fully distributed, but before COVID, we did have an office in San Francisco. We got rid of it quite quickly. Um, so yeah, I think and then as the pandemic unfolds, I think we'll stay remote. Um, but I do foresee a future where we have offices, but that'll be driven by what employees want and what teammates need. So if you're in San Francisco and you're living with multiple roommates, working at home might not be great for you. So you'll want somewhere to go to do your work. So I think it'll be very much driven by what employees want and what they need.
And has that changed, do you think, from, you're an engineering leader, you've interviewed plenty of candidates over your time. Do you see candidate preferences? Do you see the working environment coming up as part of the question or evaluation criteria for candidates wanting to join different teams?
Yeah. I mean, I think this has been an emerging trend since before COVID, and I think from an employee's perspective, they've wanted this flexibility, and they've wanted optionality. And I think what COVID has changed is it's changed the leadership's perspective. So people now see that this is possible, it's not scary, and it could be potentially be a competitive advantage if you offer these different options to your teams.
From your perspective, what do you think the most compelling arguments are for hybrid? And I think, given the audience we have today, leaders across HR, engineering, often hear that there may be misalignment amongst leadership team on what is the right way to approach some of the return to work. And if someone is advocating for a hybrid model, how would you construct that argument internally around
Yeah,
the pros for adopting
yeah.
a model like this going forward?
Yeah, so I think it starts with acknowledging that the people on this call are not factory workers. Like, we do creative work, and it's kind of nuts to think that sitting at a desk 9 to 5 is the best way to be productive. And any creative knows that energy fluctuates, attention fluctuates, and um, I often find myself unproductive in the in the early afternoon. So why do I have to sit at a desk in a badly ventilated office just in order to like fulfill my job duties? So I think what the opportunity of hybrid work is essentially to attend to people's needs and give them the structure and opportunity to be as effective and productive as they can possibly be. And different people have different needs. So there's logistical needs such as childcare, elder care. Some people have health issues, or maybe they can't commute as easily. But then there's also attention needs. So one of the things I like to talk about is like, are you an owl or a lark? Like Dylan, like, are you an owl or a lark? Do you know that? Do you know what I mean?
Am I a late night or early morning?
Yeah, so if for people on the call, if you think about when you naturally go to sleep, and then when you would naturally wake up, take the midpoint. And if the midpoint's 3:30 a.m. or earlier, you're a lark. If it's later than 5:30, you're an owl, right? And the thing is so I'm an owl, so so my attention is actually dropping early afternoon, and it's not a great time to be creative or productive. But in the early evening, that's like when I'm like super on. So the 9 to 5 workday isn't structured around the needs of me to being most productive. So hybrid work, I think, is interesting because it kind of breaks us from these constraints that impose when and where we can work. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is just, and I think speaks to Terminal's mission, is to just unlock talent pools in other locations. And the best people for your team may not be all in the same city. So if you want to have the best people to work on your mission, you need to unlock other locations, and that increases the diversity of the pool. So ultimately, I think of hybrid work as being an issue of accessibility and inclusion, making work more accessible, information more accessible, and then including more people in the ability to serve your mission.
So I'm definitely a lark. I think my mornings, right when I get up, kind of sun coming up, is when my mind is very attuned, and nighttime is non-productive
Yeah,
for
I'm
me.
the opposite. It takes me 2 hours to wake up, and if you force me to work at 9 a.m., I'm going to be super groggy.
Curious, on your team, do you track that? Do you know what percentage of your team are owls or larks?
We've talked about it. We don't track it, but I think it's always interesting to see who turns up at 7 a.m. and who doesn't roll in until 11 a.m. And Medium and Google, that was the same. Like, we'd have people at their desks at 8 a.m. and some people would roll in just before lunch. So we were already operating in that way. It wasn't intentional, and then and it did cause tensions.
One thing you touched on, because I think there's hybrid models, and I think about that at a company level of like, what are the top-down kind of structure that you're putting in place, the guidelines, the policies, the technology, and the expectations on employees. And then also to the individual, kind of what we're talking about a little bit is the idea of flexible work, or powering on when you are most ready to do your best work. Some leaders are very put off by that term, flexible work.
Yeah.
How do you think leaders should approach that, or how do you define flexible work in a way that maybe doesn't scare too many people around the the vagueness around boundaries.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely hear this a lot, and I think it's kind of this gut reaction or this instinctual fear response, and I think they're honestly worried that people are going to slack off, and it goes to kind of two fundamental schools of management, so theory X and theory Y, which I think they date back to the 80s actually, and so what theory X is that your employees are intrinsically lazy, and that they need to be motivated through coercion and reward. And theory Y is that your employees are inherently interested and drawn to a purpose and intrinsically motivated. So I think if you're building an organization with the assumption that people are lazy and not going to do the work, that yeah, it's very difficult. But if you are hiring people who are drawn to your mission, who enjoy the work, see craft, um, then um, then yeah, I don't think the visibility is as necessary. So one other way of talking about this is thinking of it as a high trust environment. So if you trust your team to do their work, to be accountable, to um, be engaged, then yeah, you can relax a little bit. So so the idea of like butts in seats, 9 to 5 in the desk is very much about visibility. And if I don't see you working, you're not working. But I think also the reality is that that was just a complete myth anyway. If I'm across the office, like seeing as like Dylan at his desk, like you could be on Facebook or like browsing Twitter, and like I would never know. So people were kidding themselves anyway. So you've got bigger problems if that's how you're motivating people.
That's super interesting. I like that the difference in the model, and it sounds like it's going to force kind of the middle management, the people who are directing a lot of the frontline workers, to really think differently
Hmm.
around their approach. Do you see, maybe that being one of the biggest challenges is how to support and adopt managers? And maybe you can share what
Hmm.
are other challenges or things that companies are going to miss through this transitionary period?
Yeah, I think honestly, I think the line managers have the hardest job, and I think so. Even if you're a good manager in an office, it's very hard to be a remote manager, and that's because a lot of the tools and tactics we use are dependent on these informal like communication channels. So there's management by walking around, where you go chat to someone in the kitchen, or you stop by the desk and have hang out, and you kind of get a sense of is someone blocked, or are they unhappy? Or maybe you see someone roll into the office looking like really stressed every day of the week, and you get and you're like, oh, I should talk about them, see what's going on in their personal life. Maybe they need some help or a break. So people are using these informal ad hoc information channels as a way of sensing into their team health and what's happening. And when everyone's remote, you don't have access to that. So what we're doing at Range is actually helping managers figure out new approaches to getting this information and sensing this information so they can help their team effectively. And the two core things are really like what's happening, and then a sense of connection. So when everyone's in the office, it's very easy to build a sense of belonging and alignment. When everyone's remote, if all your meetings are just purely transactional, you're going to gradually drift apart, and you're going to feel lonely and not feel connected to the team, and then that leads to a lack of trust and potentially conflict and whatnot. So I think that's definitely the manager's hardest job, is essentially knowing what's happening so they know where to help, and then keeping the team connected.
What are the right guidelines, you as a CEO, what do you expect then from your managers, and what expectations do you have for them to ensure that they're, not defaulting into the way things were, but being a
Hmm.
supportive manager? How does that kind of change from your perspective as far as your expectations?
Yeah, so I think it's different for people who are fully remote versus hybrid. Like fully remote forces you to be really intentional across the board and figure out new ways of working. And the guidelines we suggest are for companies to put together a set of work policies or commitments. So like when and where are we working, what are our core hours, when do you come into the office, etc. And then the second is communication guidelines. And these communication guidelines are essentially what prevent a lot of the issues from emerging. So when do you Slack an email? When do you call a meeting? How do you take notes and make sure people have access to them? How do you do docs? How do you do team building? So those issues affect remote teams and hybrid teams. So the big issue of hybrid work is that you have some people in the office where you have visibility and presence, and some people aren't in the office. So humans are like intrinsically lazy. It's like unfortunately we're like water. We default to the easiest route. So if you're not intentional about the information channels, you fall back to these in-person ad hoc communication methods, such as turning to your neighbor and just talking to them. And then that means the person that's remote doesn't have access to that information. So what my expectation of managers is to basically build up a set of principles and rhythms that ensure that the team is operating effectively, and then to sustain those. And that's about creating, transparency, about creating touch points where people can share information, and then making sure that you have an inclusive environment that takes care of both the needs of the people in the office and the people that are remote.
When you talk about some of those cadences, those principles, do you find that organizations work best when those cadences and principles are mimicked across teams, or does each individual manager kind of find the right set of principles, the right cadence for their
Yeah.
individual? What do you see
Yeah, it's a
working?
great question. I think the, I think it's a mistake to think that there's a one-size-fits-all solution for an organization, especially a large organization, because different types of work need to happen differently. So if you have an infrastructure project, your cadence is going to be very different to if you're working on, say, like an R&D project, or some new like user UI feature or something like that. So I think you do need to think about what is the cadence for your team, but then you also have to think about what are the cadences for the team-to-team communication. So it's almost like a hierarchy where there's this is how we behave as a team, and then this is how we behave with respect to the broader organization. And the broader organization cadences and channels and principles, they should be uniform. So this is how we send updates on our progress or on our objectives. This is how we check in on strategy and goals. Those should be more uniform. But on the day-to-day operations, I think it's very contextual.
One thing that I found a little bit with through this pandemic, I was used to doing a lot of client meetings, going in person, traveling to see our team often. And there's a little bit of the kind of Groundhog's Day of getting up and doing the same thing over and over. Do you find that there are ways to creatively kind of mix up things, whether
Yeah.
it's structure or process, and do you find doing that helps to kind of liven things up a little bit for different teams?
Yeah, I think definitely. Yeah, I think you need to constantly evolve your processes, and when things do feel a bit Groundhog Day, switch things up. And I think there's multiple reasons to switch things up. One is that the current processes aren't serving your needs anymore. Like that Monday morning meeting that worked when you're 7 people isn't working when there's 11 people on the team, or your recap on Friday is getting kind of boring. So yeah, I think you definitely mixing it up on a cadence that feels natural. So we actually have we call it the Teamwork Guild. So we have a group of people, a cross-functional group of people who meet and think about like how we're working together and how we're going to change things up. And we shift up these the staff meetings quite regularly. So at the moment we're doing a round of like MTV Cribs on Fridays, so getting to know people's houses. But if you did that every week for 2 years, it's going to get a bit boring. So we'll do a round and then we'll move to something else. But the purpose is to learn a bit more about people, to connect, to have fun, to laugh, and that purpose stays the same. But how we do that like shifts up. And then yeah, for stand-ups and other meetings, yeah, you can also mix things up. Like maybe for a few weeks you do icebreaker questions, but you get tired of icebreaker questions, so you do something different. We also do games at the end of meetings sometimes, and yeah, and shifting up different types of games that you're playing.
I love the MTV Cribs. I think we might have to borrow that from you.
It's really fun.
One question, and then I want to talk about some of the technology and tools that are at people's disposal. But one thing is how much of kind of policy setting do you allow to be kind of bottoms up employee? You mentioned kind of your guild to be able to maybe have a clearinghouse of discussion and decision making. But are there certain things that you think leadership needs to just own and set at a high level, and then allow other decisions around work communication, both kind of medium and frequency, to come more bottoms up? Or is there a right kind of approach around some of those decisions, whether bottoms up or top down?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it's culturally dependent. There's a book that predates all this called Scaling Up Excellence, which has essentially like two models. Are you a Catholic organization or you're a Buddhist organization. And a Catholic organization would be like Apple, where everything is like completely uniform, it's very rigid and structured. A Buddhist organization would be like Google, where it's very chaotic and bottoms up. So I think first it's being like aware of your culture and how you want to operate. Do you want to be uniform? Another example is like In-N-Out versus McDonald's. So McDonald's actually has a bunch of like local variation, whereas In-N-Out is like everything is exactly uniform. So I personally prefer a blend of bottom up and top down. So top down, you can think across the whole system and what does the system need, but by definition, you don't have visibility into exactly what all individuals need in the organization. So you need the individuals to be sensors, and the individuals need to then tell you what they need and how they're doing and what they need to be effective. So so that's why I like the bottom up as a way of doing maybe culture building or teamwork, and top down more about say strategy and goal setting and how we make sure that everyone's feeling aligned.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I like that framework. Moving to the last question that I have is, there's been such a proliferation of different remote work tools that
Hmm.
are allegedly bringing us more productivity and collaboration. Seems like you could probably spend every day on a demo of a different tool these days. But
Yeah.
curious, from your perspective, are there must-haves in your toolkit for your team to be successful? Um, are there things that you think teams should avoid unless
Hmm.
they're a certain model? And maybe you could share a little bit about the range remote collaboration stack.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so to answer the first question, range, of course, I'm biased. But yeah, actually, more seriously, um, I think is that you can't just adopt tools. Like you have to think about what is the purpose of the tool. So take a step back and think intentionally, what is our stack and what is the set of problems that we need to solve. So the way that we think about our stack is we have synchronous communication. So video calls, we're going to use Zoom. For chat, we're going to use Slack. Then there's asynchronous communication. So we actually really like async video. So we use Loom for async video. We do async check-ins. We use Range, of course, and that cuts down on meetings and keeps us all in sync and makes sure that everyone knows everything that's important that's going on while keeping focus. And then we use email for non-urgent async communication. Slack is really bad for non-urgent things. And then there's a stack of in-context collaboration tools. So the way we think about that is for knowledge management, Google Docs. For design, we use Figma. For code and issue tracking, it's GitHub. Project management is Asana. Recruiting Lever, and then brainstorming Mural. And that's essentially like a hybrid stack. And then outside that, there's a bunch of other little tools, but they tend to be very work-specific tools. So the marketing team might be using Hotjar or Google Analytics. The Eng team might have Sentry as well, but those don't need to be part of the hybrid stack because they're not involved with cross-team collaboration or communication. So I think what your tools for synchronous communication, what your tools for async communication, and then how you're going to collaborate on work. And there's probably half a dozen tools that is actually the work collaboration tools.
That's super helpful. Are there any gaps you think in tools today, or do you feel like you've got the necessary tools to get the work done?
Yeah, for our team, I feel pretty good about the stack we've built. I think the way that we operate is that we're so evolutionary, and that every week we're asking like, what could be better? So if there is a gap, there is just we don't see a gap for very long, and the reason we built Range was actually the gap that I saw running teams at Medium and Google. I felt that there were all these tools for like tasks, and then there were all these tools for like HR stuff, but there was like nothing in the middle. So Range is really the intersection of, day-to-day work and then the sort of like more teamwork oriented aspects. So
Awesome. Well, we've got a few takeaways here before we open it up to questions. And Dan, thanks again for a great conversation here. So I think a couple takeaways. One, all companies should be planning for a flexible future based on some of the poll data. I think this group and this audience are thinking that way, but that hybrid isn't a one size fits all, that there are different decisions and different models. There's a spectrum, not kind of a binary bookend on either side. There's different components that define that model, but also create structure around the team to know how to operate, work policies, communication guidelines, documentation, tools, and to lead to successful hybrid teams, unlocking remote collaboration. And I think tools, whether it be range, but also defining what are the common technologies and what are the interaction points, medium frequencies that allow teams to thrive in this environment. Dan, I don't know if you have any other kind of comments for takeaways here before we move to Q&A.
No, I think you covered it nicely.
Awesome. Well, at this point, thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'd love to turn over to some questions.
All right. Great. Thank you so much, Dan and Dylan, for that discussion. So we are going to go ahead and take some time for questions now. As a reminder for everyone in this webinar, please be sure to type your questions into the question box in your control panel. So it does look like we have a couple of questions to start. So this first one here is for Dan. Dan, as an engineering leader, what would you say are some of the unique benefits or pitfalls of going remote for engineering teams in particular?
Yeah, so I think for engineering, there's nothing intrinsically that requires us to be in the same place at the same time. It's just that many of us learn strategies for collaborating that require to being in the office. So like co-located pairing or talking to your neighbor for help, or just the weekly meetings. So I think the benefits of go to the general benefits we talked about before, which is embracing flexibility and allowing people to work when and where makes them most effective. The biggest pitfall that I've heard is, in addition to the challenges of being a manager, is that junior engineers are often left out in the cold. And if a junior engineer is sitting next to a senior engineer, it's very easy for the senior engineer to help them, or to spot when they get stuck, or the junior engineer can just turn very easily to their neighbor to get help. So I think ensuring that you have mechanisms in place for your onboarding and like continuous onboarding that allow junior engineers to get support and remain unblocked is like one of the key things for engineering teams.
Great. We have another question here from Sahar. How do you manage working as a team if everyone is flexible and works their own times across different time zones? How do you find common times to meet?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question, and there's a few different strategies. So what we do at Range is we have core hours. So we say that even though we're spread over multiple time zones and people have flexibility, we expect that most days people to be available between 11 and 3. And there's obviously some flexibility within that, but as a general principle, that's when we have core hours. And then we really lean into scheduled reoccurring meetings. So we've basically designed a cadence of touch points. So at the start of the cycle, end of the cycle, then a couple of touch points in the middle. And that means that there's always this point where people can get their issues resolved or know where to bring information or challenges. If you fall back to ad hoc meetings, it's really easy to become completely overwhelmed and your calendar to just degrade into a nightmare. So we really think about intentionally scheduling the in-person touch points.
Great. We have another question about engagement here. Tina says, how do you engage employees on a daily basis that are extremely introverted, aside from constantly planning activities or one-on-one meetings? Is it best to leave them alone if they're doing great and then only engage when there are meetings/activities or necessary chats that pop up?
Yeah, so I'm super introverted, but so I think the thing about introverted people is they still want human connection, but the human connection is just high pressure, high stress. So it's really easy to withdraw, right? So human connection is really important even for introverted people. So and also introverted people will find forced socializing even more stressful. So what we think about is instead of it as like socializing, it's more about belonging. So how do you create a sense of belonging on your team in a way that is natural and authentic? And there are a bunch of different strategies, and I think it's important to figure out what works well for you. So Zapier, for instance, they're a fully remote team. They have gift parties in Slack. So this sounds crazy, but like someone will like post gift party, and then there'll be like a huge stream of like funny gifts, and that's one of the ways that they build connection. So that's not going to work for everyone, but that's what they've solved. We do this MTV Cribs thing, which even introverted people, get to show off their houses and introduce us to different parts of their personality, and that works for us. So there's definitely those types of activities which I think you need to sprinkle through your cadence of work, and then for actual work meetings, it's important to think about how you layer in belonging cues into these work meetings. So we do check-in rounds at the start of a meeting. So everyone has to speak at the start of a meeting, and then if they speak then, they're more likely to speak later. It also sets a level playing field, and it's just a really great way to sort of like contextualize how everyone's doing. Um, and yeah, so I think focus on like different tactics and different strategies, try things out, figure out what's authentic, and then make sure there's a good drumbeat of touch points, both in the context of work and in the context of purely like team building activities.
Here we have a third question from Eric, who says, how do you think folks who are involved in multiple teams will survive in hybrid, where team A is in office some days and team B another? Say, for example, director level folks who want to spend times with multiple teams.
Yeah, so again, like I think there's multiple approaches to this. And I think it's essentially like intentionally designing like how you interact and how that director interacts with multiple teams. So if you're doing a synchronized hybrid approach, maybe the director runs all their staff meetings on Wednesday, and they make sure that's how they check in all the teams. Or maybe, unfortunately, the director for their particular role in that organization has to work in the office 4 days a week. So even though engineers get to work at home 3 days a week, your senior management team has to be in the office. I think the optimal outcome is to go the default digital route where you don't really care where people are, and that you figure out ways of communicating and collaborating regardless of whether people are in the office or remote or at home. And I think that's the ideal future, and maybe we'll get there in a few years. But that's something to shoot for.
I think the takeaway I get from some of these questions is that there needs to be a lot of thought around this part of the structure of teams, of time zone, of meeting cadence than there ever was before. That seems to be
Yep.
just something that seems like should occupy a lot of leadership's thought process, is setting up all of the teams and the structures and the managers and the individuals for success here, which I think we had such a convenience of just throw everyone in an office and it'll all work out. And now
Yep.
there's a lot more intention, thought, and structure and philosophy that goes into it.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. I think these things would have helped you pre-COVID, pre-remote, and I've often said that if you make remote work, it makes it makes all work. It works better for everyone because your process is more intentional, it's more inclusive, it's more um, predictable. Um, but yeah, I think remote and hybrid just amplify all the problems that already existed, and they force you to solve them. Um, and then, we spend so much time designing engineering systems and how this database will function and what the interface between these two services are. Yet we don't think about how this team's going to work or how these two teams are going to work together. And then, and that's what kills projects. That's what kills teams, and that's what means that you have an employee turnover of like 20% a year. So if you focus on how the team works, everything else gets easier and better.
Just maybe a little provocative question, Dan, but when thinking about, you bring up systems, and it seems like this is a complex system now that has to be
Hmm.
designed, which used to not be the case. Um, do you see someone coming from more of a system design approach being really helpful in that discussion, or do you see this traditionally falling in the HR leaders camp? I mean, should there be almost
Yeah.
more of an engineering mindset brought into the fold now that didn't used to be the case?
Yeah. So I think we can't. So even the best HR leaders don't have enough context on how work happens day to day on the ground to be able to design these systems. So any good approach is a collaboration between functional leaders and HR people leaders, and it has to be a cross-functional group, and where you're actually analyzing and designing how you're going to solve this. And then to your question about systems thinking, I think that is one of the core competencies of any discipline in 2021. Like everything is more complex today. So it doesn't matter if you're a marketer, an engineer, a people ops person. If you have a core competency in systems thinking, I think it makes everything else easier and it makes everything else better, because these are complex systems, and most engineering systems aren't actually complex, they're complicated. The thing about complex systems is they're probabilistic. So you don't have full visibility of everything that's going on. So you're essentially designing solutions for complex systems, which is, it's very challenging, and it requires new approaches and new ways of thinking.
We have a couple questions here around compensation strategies for different hybrid work models and how to deal with localizing pay. So do you keep everyone on the same pay scale or localize to the geos when going remote? Do either of you, Dan or Dylan, have any insight into those questions?
I feel like, Dylan, you probably should have a better answer.
Yeah, we've seen examples across a number of different companies that we work with and a number of different strategies. And I would say in the long run, most companies trend towards local market forces to dictate pay, because if you are paying equally kind of across the board, inevitably that's kind of unequal based on either cost of living or different locations, or as you're reaching some other scale, you're going to make decisions that actually optimize for costs later down the line. So I think we've seen a lot of different strategies, whether it's looking regionally or looking at a city level and creating kind of a numeric score and value, and then staying honest around keeping everyone within the ranges for those particular regions or cities. But I think as we look global, for many companies, it's extremely hard to scale a team successfully with pure San Francisco, Bay Area, New York salary ranges. When you think about an average seed round being maybe $4 or $5 million, when you think about salary expectations, it basically forces you, if you want to have a 5-person engineering team, you have to be able to produce a product within such a short period of time to even reach the next milestone. And so I think part of opening up a global talent pool does create the adequate competition, but also adequate access to talent at different levels that creates new interesting ways that companies can scale and acquire the resources they need to move faster. So predominantly companies are picking a regional approach with pay scales that relate to the local competitive dynamic and the local market dynamics. Although we have seen some companies that kind of do blanket, regardless of where you are, it's one pay scale. But I think that's definitely still the minority of thought across the board.
All right, thanks, Dylan, for answering that. I know that's a kind of a complicated one. So it does look like we're out of time for additional questions. Dan and Dylan, before I take our participants through Wrapup, I want to thank you both so much for making time for this discussion today, and for your insights during our conversation. It was great having both of you, and we do hope to have you again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Fun conversation.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thanks everyone for joining.
Great, thanks guys. So to our attendees, before you leave our call, we would love if you could answer a short poll on your interest in some different types of events in the Work at Terminal, which I am launching now. So as we wrap up, a couple of quick reminders. This webinar has been recorded and a link will be made available to participants within 24 hours over email. I'd also like to remind you to please provide your feedback in our post-webinar survey, which should show up in your browser window as you leave the call. So thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you again next time.